This is Teachers Talk Radio, and you are listening live.
Hello, welcome to the Wednesday Late Show with me, Hannah Wilson. I have taken over the Wednesday Late Show because tonight I have a special guest. I am joined by Andy Goldhawk, who's going to be talking about his new book, The Super Quick Guide to Learning Theories and Teaching Processes. So feel free to listen in or write in any questions you may have.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and you are listening live. Tune in live at ttradio.org, or to join in the conversation, download the Podbean app and search Teachers Talk Radio. Follow the hashtag TTRadio. Tune in, talk it out with Teachers Talk Radio.
Hello, welcome. And can you hear me all okay, Andy?
Hello, hi Hannah. Yes, I can hear you.
Fabulous. Well, thank you for joining me on this Wednesday night. It feels like this week is one of those weeks that it should be like a Friday night, not a Wednesday night, with how long this week is going. I've still got open evening to go tomorrow, so it's
goodness.
It's I think that's the Tom was talking about it earlier on Twitter. It feels like this September is a long September, but it's still nice to be back in the classroom and getting going. So thank you for joining me.
Absolutely.
Do you want to chat about your kind of background in education, and then we'll chat about the book, a little introduction about yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. I trained a long time ago now, about 20 years ago, as an FE lecturer. And I first trained as a Spanish teacher. And I never got a job as a Spanish teacher. So I ended up teaching ESOL in colleges for about 15 years. Until 2020, and then in 2020, just before COVID, I took the leap over into HE for a bit of job security, for one thing. So I'm currently working at UWE in Bristol, and I'm doing a little bit of teaching, teacher training, but my day job is actually not in teaching at the minute. I'm basically a senior bid developer across the social sciences. So
Amazing.
That's me.
That's a very, very varied background. But I think that's the thing that makes us teachers, is we all kind of develop through teaching and kind of find our own little paths. So what brought you to write this book then?
Well, I'll try and keep it succinct. I did a doctorate in education from 2015 to 2019. As I was finishing that off, I finished that off in 2020, and it's fairly typical to start writing journal papers, academic stuff. After that, I didn't really want to do that. I was a bit exhausted, but I still wanted to keep learning. So this is a very non-traditional way to end up writing a book. I had a brainwave in the car one day that I was thinking, where are trainee teachers? Lots of trainee teachers communicate on social media. So I ended up creating this Instagram page, which I think you found, called Learning Theories Shared. And I was basically doing it for me to keep up my own learning on different theories and approaches. But also I thought, well, it might be of use to other people, trainees and other teachers. And that ended up being this book a couple of years later. So it was never planned.
No, that's the thing. And I was like, I knew that you were the person to come on my show when I read the start of your book, where you said about everything comes in your car when you're driving along with loud music, which is definitely me on my way to school as well. I'm like, that's where I have my best thoughts. I don't know what it is, but it is. But and that's my thing as well, is that because it is, you can definitely. I wish I had this book when I was training, because there's just so much to absorb and people kind of tell you so much, and then it's really hard to kind of remember what's what. And I've got my trainees in tomorrow, so I got my art trainees for my county and the next county coming over for the day. So I'm like going to be like, get this book, like, because I feel like I'm going to tell them loads of information and give them loads of strategies, and they're going to be like, which one, what was what, and what does it mean? And I think it is really nice to kind of have it in that place. But also from the other side of it, I'm doing my master's in education, so I'm like I quite enjoy it as well. And from that point of view, that having this kind of almost dictionary of everything. But the nice thing is the way that you've laid it out, and the fact that you've got what they are, and then you kind of say a little bit whether you agree with them or disagree with the positives and negatives of them, and then kind
Yeah,
of further reading and things. So from my perspective, from that point, I'm like, oh, I can, like, this is going to really help with my writing as well. So
oh,
it's
good.
not just from that point of view. I think it's quite nice that it works for everybody. But what made you kind of lay it out like that? Because it's definitely different.
I just wanted, well, like, yeah, I was just thinking about me 20 years younger, as a trainee teacher, and so many of us as trainees, and then later on throughout our careers, these sort of terms, even the term pedagogy, so the very basic, learning and more complex stuff, theories of learning and approaches, inquiry learning. You just start hearing them in classrooms, staff rooms, and in your teacher training classes, and mentor. People just start using this language, and I just thought, oh my goodness, I don't want to keep stopping everyone every 10 seconds to say, what does that word mean? So yeah, that was, so it's just, the aim is for it to be, each page just doesn't have like one word. My mission was to have a book that didn't have one redundant or superfluous word. I just wanted to get to the punch, like, what does this mean? And then somewhere along the line as well, I developed this interest in, or I noticed that in staff rooms, some people get very passionate about theories and approaches, and I wasn't always certain that we were thinking critically about them. So it was really important to me that I just put the I mark on each page, which is a potential pitfall, or where I'm summarizing somebody who's critiqued it, or I just think that's so important to think about something in the round before we launch into a particular approach. And then so it's a springboard into the academic literature. So if somebody really gets into inquiry learning, then I've just popped in a couple of references for what I perceive to be really good literature that goes more deeply into that approach. And then the fourth part on each page is signposting. So, if you're interested in this, you might be interested in, if you read the page on operant conditioning, then it would make sense to also understand what classical conditioning is. So those are the four parts. But yeah, it was basically the antidote to the 600-page tome on how to be a teacher that's, they used to be waved around, maybe they still are, as a trainee teacher and others. If you're really busy and you've suddenly got marking and planning and trying to work out what it is to be a teacher, and flicking through chapters of these huge books, that's what I wanted to, this is an antidote to that, or it's just an alternative way to that.
And I think it is that as a trainee teacher, there's a lot to take on board, and kind of having that place that you can kind of look to for, oh, what did that mean? Somebody mentioned that, but because also you're kind of a little bit embarrassed in those early days, and you're like, oh, I don't want to ask what that meant because I've forgotten. But
Yeah.
you've kind of got them all there. Or if you're, especially with today, with the benefits of having online CPD, it's great that you can kind of attend all that, but also there's kind of
Yeah.
quite often there can be loads of people on it, and you don't want to ask stupid questions, and it's like, oh, actually I can just double check what that means. And I remember there's a classic one in here, there's Bloom's taxonomy, and I remember that early doors, everyone was talking about it. It was like, yeah, I use Bloom's, and I'm like, yeah, me too. I'm like, which which words was it, which one is it, what order is it? And I remember having to go and Google it and search it for it all the time, because I just forgot which order it was or what words specifically that you had to use. So it's nice that kind of, I think I would have loved it as a trainee, definitely, to be able to kind of dip into it. And I guess it is. They were talking about this just on Twitter as well, about kind of teacher workload, and the fact that that is like a big thing now. And I think
Yeah.
that, and especially with the trainee teachers, is that you don't want them to kind of exhaust themselves and give them loads of stuff and run out of opportunities to kind of teach because they've exhausted themselves trying to read all this stuff and work it all out. Like having kind of like, it's almost like a little Bible of kind of all the different terms and have one place to look for it. And if they wanted to kind of then go further, they've got those signposts, which is really nice.
Well, thank you. I'm so glad that you've taken the book in the way it's intended. You know, I sometimes use the word like a mini Bible for a little compendium of stuff that will be useful for teachers. And I've heard that had some lovely feedback from experienced teachers about the fact that, you know, you forget stuff as well. So you remember the term Bloom's taxonomy, but not always all of the verbs associated with it. And then you can kind of skim the internet at break time, trying to remember them or something. So yeah, I'm glad you picked up on that.
But it is that as well. As even experienced teachers, we need to remind ourselves of all the different kind of words. And I had that a few years ago. I had a trainee teacher, and it was during COVID. So in fairness, I didn't have as long with her because we had a large chunk of it doing online learning at home. And I think maybe I'd have spoken to her about it at some point had we been in school. But I remember her going for an interview at the end of the year, and she was like, they asked me about this and I didn't know what it meant. And I was like, oh, that's just this. It was just a different word for it. But because we
Yes.
hadn't had that time in the classroom, I hadn't kind of, it was one of the things that we'd kind of lost a little bit trying to get us skilled up as quick as we can, having not been in the classroom, was all those kind of key terms. And I think when we've been in teaching for so long, we kind of forget them all.
Yeah.
And it is nice because there's definitely, like you said, I read through it and I was like, oh, I've forgotten about that, or oh yeah, I do that, but I didn't know it was called that. As well is quite often another one.
Yeah. You know what? I learned so much in the writing of this book myself, and that was kind of part of the selfish pleasure of doing the writing. Just small things as well, sometimes fairly trivial, but you know, interesting, and other times more important. Like, you know, the Maslow's hierarchy of needs. It's another kind of well known, well heard of idea, but just that Maslow never conceptualized that in a pyramid. So we always see things in triangles, which kind of infers a hierarchy of importance, or things go in a certain order, whereas they don't necessarily. And also with Bloom, you know, that's that's often seen in a triangle with knowledge at the bottom. You know, this is the lowest or the most base thing that people achieve, whereas it's not intended in that way. It's not intended that knowledge is somehow less important than evaluation. So yeah, each one has its own little wonders if you're geeky like me.
Oh, I very much am. And I think that's the, because I was even like, you've got quite a lot in here. I will talk about kind of the order, I think, in a little bit, but you've got the Johari window in there, which I've been learning about on my masters, and I've only
Okay.
just come across it. So for me, I was like, you explained it well better than my course did. I was like, oh, I wish I had this when I was writing all my Johari window things. But I think for me, it's almost like it all kind of clicks that the like the little information, the reflections, is to kind of remember the blind spot of each kind of rule. Don't forget that there's kind of this bit, or there's like, because quite often we can be like, oh my gosh, this, like, that idea, isn't it, of getting kids really engaged in something and they're really excited, and they all look busy, but is it actually kind of
Yes.
going in? It's to remember that these strategies are really, really good, but remember the flip side of kind of what they all do.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I love Johari Window. That's something I came across in part of my role was as a teaching and learning coach for about 7 years. So I became more. That's why there's a chapter on coaching, actually. It's me kind of exposing my own professional background a bit there. But yeah, Johari Window is just something that's so neat. But yeah, with all the coaching approaches, um, yeah, it's a challenge, isn't it? I think people you're working with as a coach or a colleague need to be in the right headspace for, um, you know, critical friend feedback, should we say, or, you know, sensitive conversations about practice. So yeah, that's a good one.
I just think as teachers, it's good that we reflect and think about where our kind of flaws are with our teaching, because we all sit and are quite happy to be comfortable with the bits that we're good at, but also kind of, and also as from an SLT perspective, to actually kind of look at what your staff are doing and where the blind spots are in the school as a whole is quite an interesting aspect. And from a student perspective, like kind of how does your student cohort work? Where are the little blind spots? I think like at the moment is kind of in the resilience of the kids that's kind of gone over kind of COVID, and how do we kind of build that back up and kind of, so it's, I just think I really like it. I feel like I'm really late to the game discovering the Jari window, but I'm like, this is the thing that I'm very into at the moment. But yeah, so I was very delighted to see that was in there. But I think, like, should we go? So coaching is nearer the end, isn't it? I can't just.
That's right.
So you start with foundational concepts. So do you want to talk through those ones, or kind of what made you start there?
Well, yeah, absolutely. That was quite late to the game, really. I just realised that I needed some really straightforward definitional pages. So when I had two wonderful colleagues at UE, Professor Helen King and Dr. Sean Mudd, they reviewed my early draft and they said, yeah, we like it, but why not have a page on learning itself, just simplifying the concept of learning, and one or two other suggestions. So that's all it is. It's just a very quick nod to just thinking about what it is. It's the acquisition of knowledge, but there's all sorts of things in the literature describing what it is, and that pedagogy is understood as the art or act of teaching, but there's, it has an interesting etymology, that word, and there's another word as well, andragogy, which hasn't really caught on, which is the teaching of adults. So there's a few pages on that, and because I used to teach adults, that was close to my heart. What else we got? Epistemology. I couldn't help but add that in, because when I was doing my doctorate, my classmates and I would kind of whisper to each other in the class, in part one of it, the program, what does epistemology mean? Because when you get to doctoral level, this is kind of nodding and, nodding sagely and scratching your chin as if you understand all the big words. But we still didn't. We were still just normal people and teachers who didn't understand the long words. So I thought, I've got to get the word epistemology in there. And I just thought that would be so, I would love to have known that this is a whole concept when I was training, like just the consideration of what constitutes knowledge and how we arrive at knowledge. And then, metacognition, critical thinking. The whole book really is, I hope, underpinned by trying to support the reader in developing their own critical thinking of all these concepts. So I had to have a page on that, and reflective practice. So it was quite a late edition, but these kind of underpin everything that follows in the book. And I just didn't want to assume anything. I didn't want to assume people, I just wanted to start from the beginning, basically.
It's there's quite deep language in it, but it's also, it doesn't skip any bits. It doesn't presume that the other bits to get there. So it's quite nice, because sometimes you're like, oh, I know that, and then it's like, oh no, that's what that is, and it's like it builds you into it, which is nice.
Yeah, I hope so.
And I'm the art teacher, can you tell? So I love all the little pictures and the diagrams on the bottom as well, because it just seems to make it that little bit more fun. But also, the diagrams are really useful in terms of like you were saying, the hierarchy of needs and things, and thinking about how they work together.
Yeah, I wanted it to be. I mean, speaking to the the images, that really comes from the Instagram page. It was started off with, I just wanted it to be accessible, not scary and text dense. And then my lovely editor, Amy Thornton at Sage, just let me basically have a corresponding image for each. And I hope that it might help to the readers to kind of retain what's on the page as well. If they remember a mouse eating a bit of cheese, and that's about behaviorism kind of thing, But it's no more than that. I just wanted it to be really accessible for the lay reader, and I love pictures. Originally I had all sorts of things like Yoda and all sorts of copyrighted things that we couldn't use in the end. But I was really pleased with the images that Sage arrived at.
No, I completely agree, because there's like everything from the humanist education where it's the little people, the little knitted people. It's like there's little, I'm like, oh, I remember that one was that picture. It just kind of brings it to life, and it does that thing that there's quite scary language in it, but the pictures and stuff make it, you feel more relaxed and easy to kind of access it. From, if I was a student, I wouldn't find it as daunting to kind of be like, oh no, okay, I do know, rather than having loads of text and kind of just, this is everything you need to know, and it not being, it just makes it more pleasant, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. You know what? It's interesting as well with the front page, because Sage said to me, the editor said to me, well, what would you like the front page the cover to look like? And I said, I don't mind too much. I just don't want a naff, boring looking, because, you know, there's just endless academic books about teacher training with boring covers. And some of them are brilliant books, but they're just a real turn off. And so Amy said, let's just not have an image. Let's just blow up the words and make them colourful. So, you know, I hadn't thought about this before, actually, but that's probably the only page that doesn't have an image on it, the front cover. But, yeah.
So we've got foundation content, and then we've got theories of learning, and then kind of educational frameworks. Was there, because you've got 10 in total, sorry.
Yeah.
How did you decide to split it up and kind of, because that would be my hardest thing, would be to work out what goes where and when.
Yeah, that was really tricky. The brief really was to write a third of the book. So I had a budget of between 100 and 120 pages, and a third was to be what I perceived to be absolutely essential theories and approaches, commonly referenced in, you know, common sort of teacher speak and teacher training. So a third of the things I had to see as critical. A third of the things had to be stuff that I like. And so that was lovely when I heard that. So the chapters on language learning, because I taught ESOL, English for Speakers of Other Languages. So I just had this inherent interest in that and different approaches, and also coaching. So that chapters 7 and 8 really are speaking to my own, like, it's like my own, like, proper geek out, my own professional background. But also chapter 6, because I'm so interested in what might stop learning from happening. And it's really, there's much less, I think, about that, what might be going on when learning isn't taking place. And then anyway, so the third was, what was the third? So a third was like critically important. A third stuff was what I like. And I've forgotten what the other third was. Oh no. Anyway, there was another third. So it was the brief was to split it into thirds. So I did it that way. And then you're right, it was really tricky to organize it. So the chapters came together right at the end when I had, I think, is it 113 maybe, or 110 or something pages, things that are covered. So it was just arranging them into kind of coherent, structured bunches. And some of those were easier, and some of them were trickier. And, you know, some of them could be placed in other chapters, and I'm really aware of that, you know. Yeah, that was tricky. So I just did it old school on a big piece of A2 paper and with lots of like arrows pointing in different directions. And I just arrived at these 10 chapters.
Because that's the thing. So you've got the first ones with kind of like the introduction and all the kind of theory. Then you've got kind of how the brain works and how the students learn. And then you've got kind of, like you said, the factors that affect them. So it is as well, it's not just kind of the theory, it is for like those students that kind of thinking about why things happen and why they learn the way they learn. It's not just this is what this is and these are the different kind of pedagogies listed. It kind of does go deeper, which is nice.
I think so. I think it's really important to sort of think in a structured way about I can speak more confidently to sort of adult students, but I think the context is irrelevant. I think it's the same for everyone as humans, but, you know, if somebody isn't learning something, like what might be, like, how can we sort of investigate and explore that, you know, like in our own minds and with that student. And one of my heroes is a guy called Nudd Aliris. And he's got this, I refer to him in that chapter, the factors affecting learning chapter, and he speaks to 3 dimensions and where the issue might be. So it might be the content of what they're learning, what students learning. It might be the personal incentive, the volition of the student, what's going on in their mind, but also the interaction between the student and the teacher and the classroom, and all the interactions taking place. So you can hone in on what the issue might be. And I just think that can be so helpful in the attempt to diagnose what might be going on.
I think that's something that's potentially kind of lost a little bit in kind of teacher training as well, is getting the students to understand kind of that kid isn't misbehaving because you're not teaching properly. There's other things going on, and you need to read it and discover it and understand kind of what their barriers are to learning and what's going on, and adapt, as opposed to it's like, well, that kid's just a naughty child, because they're not just naughty children. There's other things that are going on, and it's working out how to get them in. I remember quite early on how many years was I in? I might have been like four years into my teaching career, and everybody at this new school that I was at was talking about this kid, how awful he was, how horrific he was. They were telling me about how he was chucking chairs across rooms, and I was like, I must not teach this child. I have never heard of him. And I got so many people spoke about him. I was like, right, I'm going to look on my register and check. And I did teach him, and I was like, he's good as gold for me. And I remember even he used to come outside my room, and he used to have languages, which didn't get on quite so well with before my lesson. He used to pace up and down outside my room, and I'd pop out. I was like, "You're right," and he's like, "Yeah, I'm just trying to calm down because I really want to be in your lesson." And he would stay behind and help me wash up and stuff. And I was just like, he's a different kid, but we just obviously had that relationship that I always praised him and made him feel okay, but other scenarios didn't. And I just think, as teachers, it's harder now because there obviously are a lot more mental issues since COVID, and I think that's the thing that everyone kind of is struggling with, because we're having to learn so many different ways of adapting for so many more kids, as opposed to it being 1 or 2 in the room. But I think that's just such an important chapter to have included in there.
Yeah, I mean, thank you. It is for me. I just, it's really interesting, isn't it? Because there's things that you can that we can kind of quite straightforwardly talk about, like approaches to classroom management and people and personalities and subjects and disciplines and interests. But there's something that's harder, isn't it, to kind of think about and penetrate in terms of behavior and how might people be different with different teachers and different subjects. Yeah, it's a really complex one. My wife sometimes says that. My wife's a history teacher, and she sometimes has that with she said to me over the years, like, oh, that person seems, is okay in my class, but apparently it's really tricky in other subjects. So yeah.
And the other one, Tom's listening, but I'm going to say it anyway. You've put in learning styles. Now, my thing is that everybody says that doesn't exist, don't they? Everyone says that this theory has been misproven through the lack of results. But I'm dyslexic, and I really struggle to learn, especially when there's like loads of text and things like that. So for me, I'm very much if I do it, I will remember it. Same as like I'm very much, I don't need to look at instructions to build a wardrobe. I just need to look at the picture, or just physically just look at it and physically do it, and I can do it. So I'm very much that. I don't know whether it's just the artist in me. I very much love having a video demonstration for the kids to watch. I very much have pictures. I very much have annotations of how to do it. So for me, I'm like, I think it does. They do exist, because that's essentially what we do to scaffold lessons to help children access it. But I was like, I respect you for putting learning styles in there, even though there's like a lot of debate of it not kind of existing in teaching anymore.
Yeah, I mean, I heard Frank Coffield speak years ago. He's the person who led, I think, the first major study or investigation of learning styles. I'm not an expert on this, but my understanding is, so it's not. So there's been quite a few sort of meta-analyses of these. I think the position is not that people don't have different strengths or preferences in terms of like you've described. I think the issue that they would, so this is me summarizing them, is and the issue is that, so there have been lots proposed. I think it was like there's been kind of 72 different conceptions of learning styles with different categories. You know, Honey and Mumford's one of the best known, you know, activists, pragmatists and theorists and things, and they're very seductive because we go, oh yeah, I'm a pragmatist, or I'm a starter, you know, I get things started, or and there's all sorts of different categories. If you've got such a range of different conceptions of learning styles, which one's right? If you're teaching a class of 30 students with, like, they've all got different preferences, and maybe they like 2, some people like 1, others like 3. What do you do with that in the planning? So how do you navigate that? So I think that's kind of a summary of the issues. I think as well, they're speaking to the empirical evidence that exists in terms of, like, if that's why I was really careful to word this one. So it's I've got the page open. Teaching based on such categories. So it's not that there aren't preferences among humans in terms of how they acquire knowledge. It's like, what do you do with that as a teacher? Which one do you pick? Why would you pick that over the other? And if you go with Honey and Mumford, for example, how do you factor that into a lesson? You know, who do you, for example, like, so if Lucy, for example, if Lucy in your art class is a really good sort of doer, she just likes picking up a paintbrush and practicing, and other people like watching videos or watching you or listening to the like the technique, like Bob Ross style, listening and watching. He's great, isn't he? Then, you know, that's, so do we then need to play to her strength? So if it seems evident that she's really good at just picking up a paintbrush and doing it, do we kind of reinforce that by just saying, yeah, grab a paintbrush and start painting? Or is the job to then help them develop like their other skills? So, you know, I think that it's problematic in certain ways, but I certainly don't think that they're just dismissing the idea of having people having different sort of preferences in how they learn.
I mean the kind of the educational kind of staff room kind of going, that doesn't exist anymore. that was just a fad, it's gone. But I do think it's an important thing that people still need to consider, and the fact that people do learn differently. But yeah, you're right, they need to strengthen the other areas, and I think that's kind of where a school can kind of make themselves. If you can get students to understand the different learning styles and the way that they kind of can learn, then they're going to do better in their revision if they can kind of access that learning and work out. So for me, I didn't realise till quite late on that if I spoke out loud, then I retain the information much easier than if I was just to read it 100 times. If I say it out loud, I can remember it. So I think it's important that we kind of encourage them in that respect to kind of find out what works for them. But I was like, oh, I like the fact that that's in there, and even though it's and like you said, I like the little caveats that this is kind of what everyone thinks about it. And it's very well worded. Definitely.
I mean, I had to include it, and on Instagram and elsewhere, I know some people are really sensitive about this. I mean, I'm in agreement with the critique of the concept of learning styles, but I'm really aware that, you know, I think people have this concept quite broadly absorbed into their mind quite early on in teaching careers, and it can become such an sort of an embedded concept that people are quite sensitive to it being critiqued, as they might receive it. It's like their teaching being critiqued, and it's not. I think you're right to not just dismiss it out of hand, but, you know, that's exactly, I mean, that's kind of music to my ears, that you're not just dismissing it and you're thinking, well, hold on a second, like something here resonates. What is it for me? And then, you know, that's why I've got those the references to the analyses of learning styles there, if anybody's wants to read more deeply, because there's loads there. Like the Coffield one, the first one, you can just Google it and it's online. Learning styles and pedagogy and post-16 learning. So that's specifically about adult learning as well. So again, it's almost like a seminal study. It's about post-16 learning as well. So it's I don't want people to just take my word for it. This is my best kind of summary of the concept, and you know, I've tried to be very sort of delicate. There's another one which is fascinating, actually. which my colleague Sean said that I've got to get in there. What's it called? The cones of learning or something. You know, when it's like 10% of what you say.
The amount of how much you learn depending on what application you do. Yes.
That's fascinating, because I'd even used that in a teacher training session myself. I'd shown it about 10 years ago. Oh, the learning pyramid, that's it. And, you know, when I read about this one, you know, it was just fascinating, actually. I think it came from, if I remember correctly, a business context where it was like just used as a heuristic, and just like a simplified conceptualization of how people acquire information. But I think the person who, or one of the main people, Dale, who came up with it, you know, acknowledged that it was just a heuristic. It wasn't like this kind of empirically based thing, you know, that's been measured. You know, if you read something, you'll retain 10% of it, kind of thing. So it's, but I see it all over the place on social media, and I used it. So I was a bit embarrassed because I used it in my own, in a training session myself about 10 years ago, thinking, oh, that sounds nice and tidy.
I remember seeing it in kind of everybody's. That's the nice thing about this, is it's one of those that it goes through all the things that you've heard over the years, and it's quite nice because when you teach and you're like, this is the new version of this, and they don't quite they get it, but this kind of includes all of it, and it explains it so well, especially the positives and the negatives, which is really nice. And I think because that then continued on from the learning pyramid, the idea that now if students then try and teach each other, they're more likely to retain it. That's the new one. And that everyone's trying to get their kids to teach each other. But I think that leads quite nicely onto kind of chapter 5 and the way we learn, and kind of thinking about the different ways that that kind of information is taken on board and the way that we learn. So it just flows really nicely.
Well, thank you for saying that. This one was, there's lots of different kind of iterations of learning, isn't there? Formal, informal, non-formal, incidental, implicit, you know. So I just wanted to separate each one out and just acknowledge really that, I mean, it just really fascinates me that we're learning throughout our lives things without consciously being aware of it, for example. Sometimes we learn incidentally. We're doing something else, but you might be playing tennis, but you might learn kind of a nugget of useful maths somehow about degrees or something from your tennis coach. Or that's a really naff example, but you know what I mean. So I just that was quite tricky, actually, separating them out, and again just trying to be as careful in my articulation as possible about what the exact differences are in that chapter. But yeah, I love that one. I love the incidental and implicit learning, even the difference between those two.
I remember struggling with that earlier in my teaching career and could never remember which way. So it's embarrassingly, I mean, in my defense, my first teaching job I got as a maternity cover. So my first ever lesson I taught was my interview lesson, and I never had teacher training for 2 years. So I just went in and straight on taught. Wow. So I remember formal, for the two different types of assessment I even struggle with. I'm like, which one's the numbers and which one's the written bit? So I think and I think we are embarrassed when we learn the teaching, and there is so much for students to learn. It is just nice to have that place to kind of be like, oh, I know exactly where I can find that information out super quick and make sure. And then it's not so much information that you're like, I'm not going to remember that, but it is going to help kind of be able to recall it as well, which is nice.
I hope so. Yeah. I mean, that's what I just want it to be. I just wanted it to be, you know, like I said, sort of near the start, that I didn't want to have anecdotes or background, or it wasn't about like who, you know, invented this theory or first conceptualized it. You know, I didn't even want to go as far as saying this is what it looks like in the classroom.
Yeah.
I just wanted it to be, this is what it means. Think about this. This might be an issue, and this is where you can look more deeply. And also, you know, I'm talking about the other one. You know, what's really interesting about this is I've written my second book since I wrote this one. So I like, even myself, I'm like, I have to have the book open and looking at each page. But
how long did it take you to write?
That's interesting. So between about February and September 2022 last year,
That's not
so
so.
however many months is that? And then probably really annoying for the publisher, because they sent me back the proof saying, "Oh, can you have a quick look and let us know if you're unhappy with anything?" I sent back quite a lot of notes and like added 3 pages and all sorts of different things. But yeah, so lots of iterations, and even now I see a word in it that I'm like, oh no, there's a better word than that one. So the exercise of writing a book is really tricky, in terms of, it has to be good enough. If you're a perfectionist, you have to just go for good enough and as good as it can be.
That's the thing. I imagine I would spiral and I would never get it done because I'd constantly be changing it. And then it would probably be back to the original version, though.
Yeah, well, people argue over the word, form or type. With my second one is going to be a super quick guide about learning activities, and I'm kind of wrestling in my mind over comments that people have said to me over, is it a type of differentiation or a form of differentiation? Like for me, that's fairly interchangeable. But for some people, they feel strongly that there's one word that's right and one that isn't. So I have to just go with one.
That's the thing, because I think teaching varies so much from school to school, from age group to age group. But essentially, there's the backbone's the same, but kind of the wording and stuff can be different. And I think that's because obviously you've got you go through a few of the kind of acronyms in the later chapters. So you've got the GROW model and the CLEAR model, and I think they're quite nice to kind of just be able to remember what the letters stand for and have like clear explanations of things.
Yeah, I was a bit kind of overwhelmed when I trained to be a coach. I did a sort of a level 3 coaching thing as I became a teaching and learning coach, and all these models were kind of thrown at us. And I thought, well, they all sound about the same, and they often are pretty similar in terms of the sequence of what's done. But there are differences, and and the Johari window is kind of different again. It's more, it's a kind of an interpersonal communication tool. I don't think it was written to be like a coaching tool. But yeah, it's interesting. I think the important thing there for people interested in like coaching as an approach to management or teaching or working with peers is that, these are like the GROW model's the best known one, I think, isn't it? And they're really useful if you start to apply a coaching approach. It's really good to have a structure and a framework, but I think lots of people it's not like they move away from them, but you sort of think less consciously about, okay, now we're on to like step 3. It becomes more of a natural, fluid conversation, and it can go in circles and things don't have to necessarily be in an order. So I think they're all good, springboards into coaching.
And I think that's the thing with, I think coaching is quite often like not necessarily thought about enough, because I think in teaching especially you want to kind of nurture your middle leaders and your strong teachers that are good, because otherwise they're going to disappear and go elsewhere, and there's definitely a place for kind of the difference between coaching and mentoring and kind of what you can get out of a staff member and how you can encourage them and improve them.
Yeah, completely. And I'm not sure really, I can't say, but anecdotally, I'm not certain that people have got the difference pinned down really in their minds, and I think that's why that first page is in there, just differentiating or just distinguishing coaching and mentoring. And I got it down to like the simplest possible sentence, like the coach asks, whereas the mentor tells. And that's the beauty of coaching. I love a coaching approach. I kind of approach that in all the different facets of my current role. It's asking questions to the person I'm trying to help, the person in front of me, and it's empowering them. And often that person I'm talking to has got the answers or the strategy better than me. But I'm just, those questions are the tools to help them plan what they're going to do next. And I just think it can be such an effective approach. I see quite a few, I facilitate a session on coaching at the university, and it's really interesting because I think the challenge of coaching is being a good listener. It's really hard to be a genuinely good listener and not try and answer or fix the problem, but I ask the right follow-up questions. So yeah, it's an interesting one.
I think it's that, isn't it? It's we want to help and want to, especially with teaching, you want to give them the solution of how to do it better, but it's actually more beneficial to kind of just ask the right questions and for them to get there themselves, and work. And then almost sometimes you can kind of get more out of what it is that they need than kind of what you initially would have thought of if you just blurted everything out. So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I think some of them say out loud, it's some of the questions, like in the Grow model, for example, and others are about like, what's your current situation, or what have you tried yet? Who's around you that has had a similar issue and they've addressed it successfully? Who can you talk to? It's not kind of, it's just placing the person you're working with at the center of it, and giving them voice and agency as to like, well, what's going on around you, and like, who can we draw from, or what resources do you have, what can you try next? So it's a really powerful approach, I think.
And then chapter 9 is assessment. Now I feel assessment, like, I don't know how you've narrowed it down. Like, I feel like there's so many different ways to do it now. But essentially, I suppose it does all come under this, like, a few headings, doesn't it? It's just the variation of them.
I guess so. Yeah. Really tricky, because there's assessment of. I kept coming across new. I mean, as I say, I haven't been in primary or secondary education, so I'm not sort of so familiar with the vernacular. But I would come across more and more in the reading for these pages, like assessment of learning, assessment as learning. So it was, that first page of that chapter is, I think, quite important, because it's all sorts of terms that have been around for sort of longer or shorter periods of time. And I can just imagine that's a bit of a head scratcher for a trainee teacher right now, to try and think, so that's assessment as learning, I need to know, it's really important that I need to know the difference between this and that, and it could mean something quite different, just because of a small word in the middle of the word assessment and learning.
I like stealth assessment. I hadn't thought of it as being called stealth assessment, but yeah, I was like, I'm going to use that all the time now, because I just like that. But I don't know. I just never had a name for that. But obviously that's just because I've never been on it's one of those, you inherit all the names from courses and CPD that you do, but this is like, it's got everything.
Yeah, I love this one too. I think, it could be, challenged in terms of, is it kind of ethical that you might be checking out a student's understanding of something without their knowledge? It's open to that challenge. But I think, on the flip side, for anxious people, it's potentially got some brilliance in there, because you can observe somebody really flying and doing their best at something, like really shining. So is that then really genuinely assessing someone's knowledge or skills, understanding of something, because it's not about like the performance of being assessed, it's about they're really engaged deeply in that, the game or whatever it is, and that's shining, and is that a more genuine way of assessing? It's just really interesting to me.
I think it's one of those ones where the best ideas come from, because from an art teacher, especially when they get into the independent areas in kind of GCSE and A level, and they kind of have their own choices, and you just kind of sit with them casually and ask them kind of questions, and you see their minds and their cogs going, and they're answering them, and then they just suddenly end up down this path of everything clicking, and it's like, they do know everything and they do understand everything, and then they just thrive. So sometimes those kind of little stealth conversations can actually really prove to themselves that they know exactly what they're doing, and give them the confidence to push themselves further. So I'm like, I'm very much a stealth assessor. I feel like I need to go write that into my assessment policy tomorrow.
That sounds good.
That's a better word for what we do.
Years ago, when I was on my teacher training, I had this brilliant classmate who said I think he was a drama teacher, But he said, I don't call it a test or an exam or something. Call it a fun quiz or pub quiz or something. Get them into groups. Let them come up with a name. So it's all about, on the surface, it's always a bit fun and it's gamified because it's about points and things. But you are actually, you really are checking what they recall about something. So yeah, there's different ways.
And then the last chapter, chapter 10, teaching approaches. So this is the biggest chapter. So this has the most in it. And I think this has probably got the things that people will have heard of most. So it's got like implicit instruction, didactic teaching and stuff. So it's got differentiation, the flipped classroom. They're all kind of things that we would have all known and heard throughout many CPDs. But I think it is just nice to have them all kind of summarised, but also kind of have that flow of how they vary from one to another.
I think so. Yeah, this is there's a lot in this one. So I've tried to kind of same as usual, kind of just summarize its meaning, but also signpost, like the scaffolding. So everyone's on board, with what scaffolding is. But I've got a second page on that with all sorts of different approaches to scaffolding. Like I wasn't familiar with I was implicitly, but I didn't know they were. I hadn't explicitly thought of the difference between hard and soft scaffolding. Pre-planned or spontaneous scaffolding around what a student's doing, and then is it metacognitive? Or sensory or interactive. So it's just, I think it could be useful for more experienced teachers as well, just to think in terms of like, how can we scaffold in these different ways?
And that's it, isn't it? Because I think, especially like when new trainee teachers are kind of understanding students' needs, especially because like our school has passports, so you can read what their needs are, and it's quite nice. They interview the students and they tell them kind of the better ways that they learn, and then there's obviously all the professionals kind of strategies that they put in place. But this kind of can break it down as to why you're doing it, or kind of, right, if they've got a sensory issue, that's the type of kind of scaffolding that you need to include. And it just makes them think. It kind of puts in the step between, like, they need scaffolding, and we all know that what that means, but actually to break it down into those different sections is really useful, and actually thinks about the purpose of your scaffolding rather than scaffolding for scaffolding's sake, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the aim. Yeah.
And then that's the thing. There's lots of, there's dirt. I mean, I use dirt, but it's one of those. I only use it kind of once or twice a year. It's in specific places. And I think that's the thing. For me, it's kind of gone, yeah, that's why it's remembering the theory as to why I put it in the places that I put it in as well. Because that's my thing, is that I like to explain to my trainee teachers as to why I teach the way I teach, and why it's ordered in the way I teach it, and why I kind of do those strategies like that. So my kids are building skills and building on prior knowledge and things, but they're learning it in lots of different ways for a reason. And this is kind of, these have the reasons as to why they work, or why they need multiple options as opposed to just one way of learning. But yeah. Have you got a favourite one in there?
Oh crikey, have I got a favourite one? That's a tricky question.
I feel like this is your baby. I don't know. You couldn't pick one child.
I mean, kind of generally, I love about, like I said, I love kind of the exploration of non-learning and mislearning, why somebody might have learned something but learned the wrong thing, or misunderstood what it was supposed to be. And just those small things. I mean, like this thing called the forgetting curve, which is pretty straightforward in terms of, like you learn something and over time you forget it. Pretty straightforward concept, but just the fact that was based originally on some 19th century research with somebody he was his own research participant, and it was about his recall of nonsense syllables. So it's kind of the original concept, even though it seems to be kind of just inherently true that you forget stuff over time, especially if you don't recall it with retrieval practice and use it. It was actually conceived a long time ago in a really kind of slightly strange way. So I suppose rather than a particular page, it's like little nuggets and things like that that I love about the whole endeavour of this book, really, for me. Sorry if that's a rubbish answer.
No, because that's completely. I picked out that when I read that one, because I've got year 10 tutor group and trying to get them to understand the reasons behind their study and why it's important is going in one ear and out the other at the moment. But I'm like, I will persevere with them. They will get there in the end. They will understand if I tell them enough why it's really important that they keep kind of retrieving that information. I feel like that I've got 25 teenage children that I've got to try and get through 2 years of their GCSEs. You do get attached, you can't help it. But yeah, so I just really enjoyed it. It was really lovely to kind of read through. And like I said, it's visually kind of really easy to read, and the way it's set out and the lovely little pictures kind of do just make me chuckle all the way through. And I think that's the thing. It needs to be lighthearted in education because we're all stressed out and busy as it is. And that's kind of what makes this almost like a little, it wasn't a chore to read it. It was an absolute pleasure because it was it was just fun. It made me smile. And I think that's hard to do with educational research as well.
Oh, well, thank you so much for saying that, Hannah. I really appreciate that.
And I will be definitely showing this to my students tomorrow because I think they might have to sit there with it open, to be honest, because I'm going straight in on majority of these. I think I should have really played bingo with my PowerPoint and seen how many of these words I've included in my day of training tomorrow because I've got a lot of them in them.
Okay.
I mean, art. We just had a new Ofsted framework come out, so we've got practical knowledge, theoretical knowledge, disciplinary knowledge, so they're going to be their kind of key ones, but just the different types of knowledge within art. But it is that thing that there's just so much to teaching that I think and that's why teaching's hard, and that's why people don't realise that teaching's hard until they get into it. Everyone just thinks it's just standing up and saying something, but actually there's so much that goes into it to be successful. And that's what's nice about this, is it shows you all the blocks that you need to be able to do it, and why it works and what doesn't work, and the things you need to consider in a really lovely way that I just think every student needs it.
So much. I appreciate that.
Well, that's our hour. We've chatted away. So thank you so much for coming and joining me and letting me have the privilege of reading your book. Like I said, it was really lovely to read, and I'll look forward to the next one, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the next one's out in January or February next year. So it's a very similar kind of format, but it's about learning activities. So, yeah, but no, it's been lovely. Thanks for having me on, geeking out about my book. Can I just say, if anyone's interested, the main place I am online is on Instagram on Learning Theories Shared. So come and have a look if you're interested.
And it's available from Sage Publishing?
And yeah, on Sage. So, and Amazon, anywhere you like. Just if you Google the title, then you'll find it.
Fabulous. Well, thank you so much for joining me on this Wednesday night, and enjoy the rest of your week.
Yeah, you too, Hannah. Thank you.
You've been listening to Teachers Talk Radio. Tune in live and listen back at ttradio.org. We look forward to hearing from you next time on Teachers Talk Radio.